Hello and welcome to another episode of Global Tantrum, the show where two international relations PhDs explain the post-war international order, first to ourselves and then hopefully to you. I am your host, Steve Pally. With me, as always, is my co-host, Professor Galen Jackson. How you doing, Galen? What's the latest?
All right, man. I'm hoping the whole Kevin Durant burner phone scandal isn't real because I like Kevin Durant. But
He's got
that's
a burner phone to do what?
oh there's a reported scandal that he allegedly like has a burner account on some social media platform and is like talking mad shit about his teammates and teammates he's had in the past. And unfortunately, in the past, he has had burner accounts that he's had to fess up to. So
Yeah.
I'm hoping it's not true.
It's kind of like, where is the lie, right? I think
Yeah.
Durant's pretty well known for this type of thing. So
I know, and like, also one of the last guys with a great nickname, Slim Reaper. So
very good.
yeah,
Yeah. That's not his preferred nickname. His preferred nickname is the servant, as I understand it.
I know that. Right.
Yeah. Also pretty good. We're going to talk about some guys with cool nicknames, albeit not in the English language, more in the Spanish language today. We're going to talk about Mexican cartels. Because guess what? We had an incident earlier this week or was it last week actually, that definitely got our attention. A cartel leader by the name of El Mencho was tracked down and killed by Mexican security forces last week. And this prompted a rather dramatic response. It's not the first time that a Mexican cartel has struck back against the Mexican state after a leader has been killed or captured. We've seen it before. I think the difference is in scale this time. Now, this guy, El Mencho, he has a name, but I'm just going to call him El Mencho for ease of use, because I think that's also what his people called him. He ran a cartel called the Cartel Jalisco Nuevo Generacion, in Spanish, the New Generation Cartel Jalisco, CJNG. And these guys are, by most accounts, the biggest and nastiest of the four main Mexican drug cartels. And if you've seen Breaking Bad, if you've seen Narcos on TV, this stuff has been dramatized. But Sicario, pretty great movie, honestly.
And it's very
Yeah,
intense.
super intense. All this stuff is very intense. And guess what? Life imitates art, because when they killed this dude, the Mexican security forces, the cartel responded by affecting 250 roadblocks across 20 different Mexican states, including major tourist areas such as Puerto Vallarta, where I have been plenty of times, as well as the Mayan Riviera. So we're talking about Cancun and Playa del Carmen. They shut that down. I believe that they shut down Cabo San Lucas. They shut down Guadalajara. 1,000 people were apparently trapped overnight in the Guadalajara Zoo as a result of this. And the cartels do this by basically dispatching guys on motorbikes. And they go to all the main roads leading in and out of one of these cities, and they start lighting cars and buses on fire, paralyzing traffic. And so we got scenes of Puerto Vallarta basically on fire, like all of these fires over Puerto Vallarta, which is a really nice tourist area and generally very safe. It's pretty shocking, right, Galen?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to preface this by saying not a topic I claim any expertise in. We're
Yeah.
spending a lot more time on the Western Hemisphere than I ever anticipated. But, I am a native Southern Californian and have spent
Mhm.
about 2/3 of my life there. So I'm a native border state guy. Yeah, I mean, just kind of learning about a lot of this for the first time, at least in a more detailed way. The most striking thing from all of this to me is that these cartels control something like a third of Mexican territory.
Insane. When I read that, I was just like, wait, what? That can't be right.
Yeah,
It is right.
that was a but the citation I saw was from the head of U.S. Northern Command from 2021, so that's a credible source.
Yeah.
Um,
If anything, it's probably gone up since then, right?
but potentially, and it's worth noting, Mexico is a big country,
Hmm.
so a third of that territory is pretty enormous. Digging into some of the sophistication of this, it's like, I guess since there's multiple ones, I think the Trump administration has formally designated 6 of these cartels terrorist organizations.
Yep.
So, in a sense, they are states within a state. They bring in billions of dollars a year from
25 billion a year, which makes it basically a mid-sized Fortune 500 company.
I saw one estimate that the cartels are the 5th largest employer in Mexico.
Right.
Um, they control very well mapped out smuggling routes. They have very well run organizations, production sites, production hubs in American cities all over the United States to get drugs out. They are also extremely well armed.
Well armed indeed,
And
right?
and it's worth noting, well, a couple things on the operation you described in the killing of El Mencho, which I apologize for butchering this. I really should do better given where I grew up. But real name Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes.
Yes.
Um, that
Nemesio. It's like Nemesis, right?
I guess
Yeah.
80% of the weapons that were seized after that raid had their origin in the United States. You let me know that there's a term for this, the Iron River of,
Hmm.
of guns that flows from the United States into Mexico. Also worth noting that this operation was in part made possible, my understanding is by a US intelligence tip to Mexican security services. But yeah, I think the key point for me here is like this is a problem largely of state capacity.
That's right.
And there is an issue as well with corruption. One piece of the problem I was looking at is that in some cases, Mexican federal forces are not getting a lot of cooperation from local and state officials who have been put on the cartel's payrolls. I think El Mencho himself was at one point a member of the Mexican police force. And
Very interesting, right?
eh,
It's yeah, at the lower levels, they have this program called Plata o Plomo, right? And it's this idea that the Mexican federal government is far away and the cartel makes you an offer if you are a mayor or a local police chief or even like a state level employee. They've corrupted a number of state level officials. It's like we will pay you huge amounts of money, like up to including like $500,000 a month, that sort of thing, or we can just kill you. And we're kind of indifferent. And as you might imagine, plenty of people take the plata, which means silver, rather than the plomo, which means lead.
and worth mentioning, by the way, like utterly ruthless, brutally violent tactics for doing
Yes.
that have only gotten more and more violent over time,
Yeah.
beheadings and things like that. I read one BBC report that compared in a few areas, compared it basically to the equivalent of a war zone. Um,
Absolutely. These guys, like they're every bit as nasty as a group like ISIS or Al Qaeda, and in some ways worse in
well, and
terms of their tactics.
I do want to hold that comparison for a bit because, I'll shout out the citation in a bit, but like there are increasingly comparisons being made between this to like the global war on terror.
Mm,
And in fact, my understanding is one of the reasons this happened when it did, aside from the fact that there was this credible intelligence report that allowed them to track El Mencho with precision. So there was just an opportunity to get him. But President Claudia Sheinbaum, the current leader in Mexico, is under a lot of pressure from the Trump administration. And
yep.
you've been hearing a lot of rumblings about the potential use of American military force to deal with this issue, which we can hold off for a second, and whether it's appropriate to, approach this the same way the United States approached the global war on terror, leaving aside for a minute that that effort itself was not particularly successful in a whole lot of ways. But like, yeah, that's the outstanding fact to me is that these in effect, if you take them collectively, the cartels are a state within a state or a number of states within a state. And I'm sort of struggling. I was kind of thinking about other examples like this. I mean, there are obviously states within states that you can think of in very different contexts,
The
like,
Vatican.
well, I was thinking more of something like the Palestine Liberation
Sure.
Organization in
Or Hezbollah, right?
southern Lebanon, right? But like I was thinking about this in the context of interstate issues related to drugs. So like there were the opium wars in the 19th century between the Western powers and China. Although in that case, it was sort of the British using military force to open up the Chinese market so that it could
and
put more
sell them
opium
opium.
into China.
Yeah.
Um,
That's a really interesting story. Just a quick aside. Basically, the Chinese told the British that the British had nothing the Chinese wanted. And so the British were unable to trade because they wanted finished goods from China. They wanted silk and other types of resources, and they were frustrated. So they used their colonies in India, British India, as a home base to manufacture opium, opened the market in China, got all the Chinese addicted to opium. This is Opium Wars 1 and 2. Oldies but goodies, not if you're Chinese, but yeah. And it was basically state-sponsored drug emporium. And that's how they got all of the hard currency and finished goods out of China. It's like, oh, looks like you guys want our stuff now. It just happens to be opium. So, closing that story off, the Chinese Communist Party has not forgotten this in any way, shape, or form. It's part of
yeah,
the century of humiliation, right?
correct.
Yeah.
Other examples I thought of, US-Turkish relations get strained in the 70s, after President Nixon declares the war on drugs in 1971 is the formal
Right.
start date. We've talked about Noriega and Maduro on this show. The example that occurred to me more recently that might be somewhat of a better fit is the financing of the decades-long Taliban insurgency in
Hmm.
Afghanistan, which I think a majority of their funds, an estimate I saw was 60% came from poppy cultivation that was used for the overwhelming majority of the global heroin trade.
What's interesting about that is like, so while the Taliban was fighting in an insurgency, they allowed the production of opium and taxed it. And yes, it did indeed finance their movement. But while the Taliban has been, actually, I'm not sure if this is the case with the new Taliban that is governing Afghanistan, but it used to be the case, like in the 90s, that the Taliban was the only entity in Afghanistan capable of shutting down opium production when they
That that's
actually governed it.
that's my understanding is that there was a
Yeah,
ban, it was effective, but it was short-lived. Then the war started.
exactly.
They relied on it and they have since again shut it down, and Afghanistan does not export nearly as much opium or, you know,
Yeah.
poppies for heroin as it used to. But like that it struck me as maybe a reasonable analogy because that also has a state within a state feel and an insurgency essentially, although that's obviously one movement. And in this case, we're talking about multiple cartels that frequently are competing and perpetrating violence against one another.
Right.
But yeah, this is a major problem. My understanding of the history, and I'll just point to a piece I read in Defense Priorities that came out last year. The cultivation and use of Mexico as a way station to get drugs to the United States is not a new problem, but it has metastasized and certainly turned far more violent only in recent decades. So in the 50s and 60s, it was marijuana grown in an area called the Golden Triangle. Mexico was also used as a route to get Colombian cocaine into the United States. But the ruling party at the time, which dominated Mexican politics for decades and decades, was the PRI. And there was sort of a tacit arrangement where the PRI looked the other way, as long as they kind of got a cut of the profits from this stuff.
Yeah. Quick
And
note about the PRI. So it's the Party of the Institutional Revolution, which is something that I really like because if you think about it, that's just like the biggest oxymoron ever. And these guys governed Mexico for like 80 years. It was a
something
single
like
party
that.
state. Yeah.
Yeah.
After the Mexican Revolution in the tens or 20s, I believe, in the
Yeah.
20th century. And they just, yeah, rotated these dudes in and out, right? It was nominally democratic, but not really.
Yeah. And
Um,
like my understanding is that basically things were a lot less violent at the time
yeah.
because the government was in effect able to mediate between these groups a lot more effectively. And that system largely breaks down somewhat ironically when, Mexico does more of a transition to democracy with the election of Vicente Fox, I think in 2000.
That's right.
And since then, this has become a lot more militarized under Fox, under Calderon,
Felipe
under
Calderon. Hmm.
Obrador. And that's really the spike in violence has been largely in the 21st century. So it's kind of an interesting story.
It's a super interesting story, and like it relates to like how the ecosystem of these cartels work and how it interacts with the Mexican state itself. So you referenced the difference between the 21st and the 20th century and like the advent of like democracy, electoral democracy in Mexico, and what that actually looks like after the sort of not the dissolution of the PRI, but the breaking of its stranglehold on power. We have Vicente Fox in the early 21st century running an outfit called the Partido Acción Nacional, or PAN. So the Party of National Action, right? And he's a dude who I think is an ex Coca-Cola executive. So he's a business guy. And he is fluent in English and had a good relationship with George W. Bush and so on. He was seen as pro business. And yeah, the problems really started there with the violence. And it's like when things are stable, when the cartels have achieved a stable configuration, everybody is in a hierarchy. They understand where they are. They understand who is in charge of each cartel. And they all have these assets that you've referred to. They all have their specific territories. They all have their specific factories and import facilities. They have their export facilities. They have their smuggling routes. They have their smugglers. All of this is well understood. It's all stable. Everybody's making money. There may be some tension around the margins, but generally people are not getting beheaded or hung from bridges or killed in car bombing attacks or any of the other stuff that we've seen, right? Because it's stable. People are making money. This is a business. If there is pressure from the outside and if cartel leaders are removed, if cartels are moved around within this configuration, if one cartel is pushed out of place, nature abhors a vacuum. And this is a market-based system. So within and between cartels, if there's an opportunity to expand, these people will take it. So you can remove a leader from a cartel. You can conduct the decapitation strategy and you end up with like a hydra. And what ends up happening is we've done this a few times, right? We had El Chapo, I think about 13 or 14 years ago now. He's in jail in the US.
I don't
We had
think it
this.
was quite that long because I think he was discovered with the NSO Pegasus spyware. I think it was more like 6 years ago or something. But
Oh, was
anyway,
it that
go on.
recent? All right, let me check that. When was El Chapo arrested? I may be misquoting here. Isn't the internet great? It's a little real-time fact checking here.
Not all the time, man.
Yeah, for certain things. Let's see here. Third arrest, 2016. Third and final arrest. Extradited to the US in 2017.
Okay.
Yeah. So close to 10 years ago. And well, no, actually January 9th, 2016. That's 10 years more or less
Yeah.
on the dot. And he was super famous and had songs written about him and movies made about him and all this other stuff, right? These guys are like they're between rock stars, movie stars, and like Mark Zuckerberg, like in Mexico, right? They're superstars. Like people in some cases, we alluded to the fact that 35% of Mexican territory are controlled by these guys. There's a reason for that. They provide goods and services.
Well, so this
You know?
is this is kind of where I wanted to focus on a bit because it's
Yeah.
like it's not like this is a new problem, right? The United
No.
States has been fighting the quote unquote war on drugs. The official start date is like June 1971. So it's been
Right.
almost 6 decades.
We've
And
gotten nowhere.
well, it's like my understanding is like in the early 90s, there was some progress made in Colombia. Most of that progress has been reversed, and Colombia is now, if it's not still as of quite recently, the global leader in cocaine production.
It fluctuates, and like Colombia was doing better for a while, but now it's doing worse again. Yeah.
Yeah. Now we have new problems like fentanyl, which we'll obviously get to.
Yeah.
You take out different cartel leaders, other people replace them.
Yep. And when they do that, there's a ton of violence because you get a succession struggle. It's like
Yeah.
Game of Thrones, basically.
Well, so it's like my takeaway from all of this was it seems similar to use the phrase the Israelis use, right? This is
Mm-hmm.
mowing the grass, not my favorite term, but like it's a forever problem if you can't get at the root of the issue. In that
Right.
case, it's you need a political settlement between Israelis and Palestinians. In this case, fundamental, and I want to choose my words carefully because I have enormous sympathy for people who know someone who's ever struggled with substance abuse. And I think at this point, there's probably not an American out there that doesn't know at least someone who's had that happen to them.
Yeah.
But there is a demand side issue,
Mm-hmm.
which is people, whether it's Americans or anyone else, have a demand for drugs. And as any economist will tell you, if there's demand for something that's illegal, you will have black markets.
Mm-hmm. I will follow, right?
Correct. And in fact, to some extent, demand has increased in other parts of the Americas and in Europe. So it's a problem that's not going away if you can't get at the root. And I'm not saying that's an easy problem to solve, by the way. We can maybe talk about some of those
Well,
solutions.
so this is interesting, right? Because certain states in the United States have experimented with legalizing parts of the drug economy, starting with marijuana. And there's some evidence that it has harmed cartel revenues, which is what you'd expect. It's like you introduce a bunch of competition, prices go down, they don't make as much money. They're not able to buy like military grade hardware in the same quantities. Unfortunately, they've replaced a lot of this with harder drugs like fentanyl and methamphetamine, which were much less likely to legalize ever, right?
Yeah.
So
Well, and also like my understanding is I don't think a lot of experts are declaring those legalization efforts, and I'm not calling for them to be criminalized by any means. I think that would not be a good idea, but
that hasn't worked either.
it hasn't been an unmitigated success. I'll put it that way. Like
No, 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 no.
it's a tough problem, right? Like you can do things like treatment programs. I think at a minimum, I guess all I'm saying is much of the public discussion focuses on the supply side.
Yep.
And you could maybe get further, and I don't know, but by investing more resources in the demand side. But I don't know exactly how that works. Like you and I are both millennials who have lived our entire lives, literally in our entire lives, within the war on drugs,
Yeah.
since we're not that old. And so I remember like dare officers coming to my elementary school and being
Same.
like, just say no, right? Like
Also, all the video games at the arcades at like bowling alleys and pizza parlors, they had the big like yeah, dare seal.
yeah.
Um
Well,
and
so it's like if you can't get at that problem, and thus far we have not been able to, it's not a problem with a solution that just settles it, right? And
no,
that's what I think is tough.
it's
And
really tough. Yeah, there's a bunch of bad choices, and I feel like the United States has made all the bad choices over the course of 60 years, and we're kind of back where we started.
I just quickly, because like I do want to talk about there is a big problem, right? So it peaked a few years ago when there was over 100,000 overdose deaths from
Yeah.
drugs in the United States. But
Yep.
I believe it is still the leading cause of death for Americans like 18 to 44. And even in 2024, there was 80,000 overdose deaths. And obviously like fentanyl is something like 50 to 100 times more powerful than morphine. So now
I
it's like,
will I will just tell you anecdotally, I have a job where I work with first responders, and so I talk to firefighters a lot. I've learned a lot more about their job here in Southern California, and they're like basically the job is 80 to 90% medical now. They're firefighters, but they're actually mostly paramedics because fire codes have gotten so much more stringent. The technology has improved. Fires are just not the same as they used to be, setting aside forest fires, which are a big problem. And
yeah,
then within that 80 to 90% medical, they're like, it's basically 50% fentanyl in these
wow.
urban areas, like in the Los Angeles area. It's like they're just constantly having to revive people with Narcan. And so they've gotten really good at it.
Yeah.
Narcan's now sold over the counter here in Los Angeles, and I think more broadly in California. So you can have Narcan on you in case you encounter somebody on the street basically undergoing a fentanyl overdose because they might die. And Narcan will save their life. But yeah, to your point, it's like it's been a scourge. It's been a scourge now for like a decade, and it's just been killing huge numbers of people in this country. And Trump's platform, like he got elected in part on stopping the flow of fentanyl. And he's said it like
Yeah.
basically every policy that we've seen, some of which we don't necessarily agree with, like has had fentanyl like folded into it somewhere. So
The
the
tariffs.
tariffs, yep, against China, Mexico, and Canada, you know,
Canada being not part of the problem, by the way,
it's
in
not
my
part of the problem, but it was at least used as a pretext. It was
yeah.
used as a pretext in the removal of Maduro as well.
Yeah.
I'm not exactly sure what the status of the Chinese are now in terms of supplying fentanyl precursors. So China is the world's foremost provider of the chemicals. It manufactures the chemicals that can then be synthesized into fentanyl. They can also be synthesized into all kinds of other stuff too, right? But if they're exporting these chemicals to somewhere in Mexico, there's a decent chance that they're getting turned into fentanyl and then sent north. So Trump has been in his trade talks and threats and trade wars and so on with China. He's been like, we got to shut down the flow of these precursors. But it's like, okay, it's like a lot of these precursors are just basic industrial chemicals, right?
Yeah.
So
And my understanding is the Chinese government has taken some steps in
some,
that direction since the Biden administration, by the way, which
yeah,
accounts in part for why the numbers have come down, although are still, as you said, really, really high, and it's still a big
in
problem.
part. But my understanding is like the latest analysis is deaths are tailing off, and this is going to sound terrible, but I think it makes sense and is probably correct empirically. Deaths have tailed off because the people who were most susceptible to overdoses have died or are otherwise no longer on the drug. And like that's pretty bad, but that's how epidemics do tend to burn out. You look at like the COVID pandemic, it's like everybody got COVID. And once you get COVID, you have more immunity the next time. And so it takes time, but eventually like kind of runs its course. And to a certain extent, fentanyl may have run its course within the United States, but it's still a big problem.
Well, and just to, I guess we already said it a little bit, but this is also a scourge for Mexico.
Absolutely.
I saw one estimate during the Calderon presidency, 100,000 people in Mexico died. And, you were just describing all the measures the cartels took to shut down tourist areas and just how
Yeah.
these guys are.
The different Mexican administrations have experimented with more enforcement or less enforcement. Calderon went to war with the cartels, and that's why we got, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of deaths and disappearances a year in Mexico. And it's not just deaths, it's like people just disappear.
Yeah.
And they're presumed dead and they're found later or never. And it's like it's terrifying. I can't even imagine it.
And so I'm just making the point because like there obviously is a serious problem in this country, the United States, that we're talking about, and the US government is looking for more efforts and cooperation from the Mexican government. The Mexican government says there are some things you guys could do, right? Like, but fundamentally, this is driven by Americans' demand, at least in this case, for these drugs. And as we were talking earlier, this flow of firearms over the border is a huge problem. I mean, in this recent raid, one of the things they found was a rocket-propelled grenade that came from the United States.
It's military hardware. These guys have armored vehicles. They have exploding drones. They have sniper rifles. They have RPGs. They have body armor, night vision, like anything you can want. Again, $25 billion a year. That's the size of Merrick.
And there's not much they can do about it. I mean, I think it was the Mexican government tried to sue U.S. gun makers,
but they didn't have standing, right?
The Supreme Court ruled last year that that they unanimously that they couldn't do that. But they're kind of throwing up their hands and saying one of the problems here is, to use again Max Weber, we do not have a monopoly on a legitimate use of force.
No, these cartels can fight the Mexican state to a standstill with these weapons of war, and also using these narco bloqueo tactics where they just paralyze the major cities and tourist areas. And the fact that they're doing it now in major tourist areas with lots of Americans and American retirees, that's a little bit new. And it raises the stakes. It raises the pressure on the Mexican government. Claudia Sheinbaum, the new president of Mexico, is stuck between a rock and a hard place. She's stuck in between the Trump administration and these cartels. And she's trying to deal with both somehow. Fighting
And
the cartels raises
and
the
sh
violence.
she does not want the US military on Mexican territory for all
No.
sorts of reasons. But, she's getting a ton of pressure from Trump. So I guess, like, this leads to the obvious question, which is what is the set of policy solutions, or maybe solutions is the wrong word since seems
What
like
can be
it's not.
done?
Yeah.
Yeah. What can be done? Let's talk about the demand stuff a little bit, because I think it's important to note that, yes, Americans like drugs and they consume them in large quantities. This doesn't make them unique
No.
by global standards. On a per capita basis, you were saying before the show that Australians like actually consume more drugs per capita, or was it more
And
cocaine per capita?
I think it was
Yeah.
cocaine specific, but that demand is also rising in Europe, other
Yeah.
parts of the Western hemisphere.
It
Like,
just so happens that the United States is the biggest consumer market in the world for everything.
yeah,
So whether that's drugs or electronics or cars, not so much cars. I think China is now bigger, or it's getting there. It's basically the US, the European Union, and China are like the three big consumer markets. And the US classically is the biggest one, and along with Europe, but it's like it's right there. I mean, it's a plum target for these business people, right? And we have to remember that they are in business. They are making money. It's like, do they have political ambitions? Maybe, but I think that's the wrong way to look at it. Do they actually want to run states within Mexico? Maybe, but that's not what they're doing primarily here. They're printing money, right?
profit.
All the stuff that they do to like command territory and distribute medical supplies and educational supplies, or like whatever they're doing in these isolated parts of Mexico, it's to maintain these supply routes and to maintain the acquiescence of the population. They're not doing it because they want to be warlords necessarily. They end up being warlords, but that's a side effect.
Well, so yeah, I mean, I honestly, I'm just going to punt on the demand side because, I have no medical expertise, but like
Yeah.
the solutions that we traditionally think of are like treatment programs, enforcement, I guess.
Enforcement, it has like largely failed, and we
Yeah.
know that the policies have been, shall we say, targeted
Yeah.
unfairly.
Correct.
Problems there. One sort of interesting wrinkle, one new thing that could be a big deal at some point is GLP-1s, which
Mm,
apparently have a very powerful anti-addictive effect, and more people are on these. So
yeah.
that could be one way out, and that has like that technology has downstream implications everywhere across our society, which is really interesting.
The other one is education, which I
Hmm.
think yields some results, but still mixed.
Yep.
Uh, so I guess I'll leave it there. On the supply side, the thing I guess I wanted to ask you about is like the reason I wanted to bracket your comparison to like the Islamic State with some of the language coming out of a number of top administration officials talking about potential military action,
Yeah.
and designating these terrorist organizations is like using military force in Mexico. I don't think is going to be a good idea, aside from it being very costly. And depending on how things go, you might end up in a counterinsurgency like campaign, which I think that is the last thing Americans want after Iraq and Afghanistan. And given
Yeah.
everything Trump has campaigned on, would be totally contrary to, not getting into forever wars and things like that. It's worth remembering that many parts of the United States, like the western third of the country, used to be Mexico. So, like,
And used to be ungoverned, by the way. Yeah, it's like we're watching this process play out in Mexico that the US underwent much like, 100 to 150 years ago, where we had all these ungoverned spaces. We had our own like sophisticated criminal enterprises in our cities during prohibition and things like that, when we had black markets. We had our own mafias. We still
and
do.
states within states, right?
States within states. That's right. But we had extremely powerful federal capacities that over the course of decades just shut these guys down progressively. And like the Mexico, its federal government is not strong enough. Its state governments are not strong enough. The geography is more difficult. There's like gigantic deserts and mountain ranges separating everything. It's very difficult, you know?
That I mean, that's part of what I was going to say, which is this seems like a very long-term problem in the best case scenario.
Yeah.
You know, and it's also like, let's say you can take out over a decade the Sinaloa cartel and the Jalisco New Generation cartel. Other things will pop up to replace them as long
Yes.
as the demand side is there. And
Yeah.
in the meantime, if like you're going to go to war basically with Mexico, you're going to jeopardize intelligence cooperation and law enforcement cooperation. And the reason I brought up that much of the United States used to be Mexico is like Mexicans remember that. So I don't think they
Uh-huh.
want the US military operating, right? Like,
No.
um, it would raise all sorts of problems potentially. And I just don't think it's a problem with a military solution.
There seems
Um,
not to be. Yeah, I like whatever military solution that would work would have to be massive and applied basically indefinitely,
but you're
right?
talking about another nation building campaign, which I think
Exactly.
Americans have emphatically rejected as something they want to do again.
Yeah, no, we'd rather like have fentanyl than like try to govern Mexico ourselves, probably. I agree with you there. It's like maybe we can operate with the Mexican state and boost their capacities so they can fight more effectively, but like the problem's not going away. It's like a very durable and stubborn long-term infection is kind of the way I think about it. And what's tough is like if you think about the calculus of any individual cartel member, Mexico is getting wealthier. It's developing. It's way wealthier than it was 20 or 30 years ago, and certainly 50 years ago, right? It has a middle class. It has, vibrant cities and technological infrastructure and good universities and so on. But that's only part of the country. Like much of the country is poor and rural. And if you are from a poor area, you don't have much education, you're in the middle of nowhere, and somebody offers you a job at like 10 times the prevailing monthly wage to work for a cartel, obviously you're going to take it.
Yeah.
Right. So, like, you have to somehow over time equalize that in terms of opportunities because, like, revenues are high. I don't know how much more they're going to grow necessarily for the Mexican cartels. They're at 25 billion a year. That's high enough to corrupt Mexico, right? But if we keep it there and we continue to expand the rest of the Mexican economy around it, it will dilute that, is kind of the way I think about it. And you have to get into these rural areas. You have to develop the rural areas. This is a project of decades. It was a
Correct.
project of many, many decades, centuries even for the United States. We just started a little bit earlier.
Yeah,
And
and the reason I brought up the Obrador example where he kind of campaigned on, I think it was called like
hugs, not bullets.
hugs not bullets, right? Yeah,
Yes.
was like let's try some of these other measures that don't involve kind of militarization and security forces.
He only had 6 years.
He only had 6 years, and he basically gave up by the end because like this stuff takes a really long time.
If he had 60 years, it's like, okay, now you're like competing effectively for these people's affections and more importantly, their paychecks.
Well, like the this is the reason I'm like kind of pessimistic about this whole issue after taking some time to learn about it is like what I see as better bets are, and one of the reasons I mentioned that they were able to get El Mencho was because they had intelligence cooperation from US intelligence services is like,
Right.
okay, so that what that means is you want law enforcement and intelligence cooperation between the US and Mexican governments. Maybe you can continue to try to work out some sort of cooperation with Beijing to prevent some of the precursors to fentanyl from getting shipped into the Western hemisphere. You can try to do better screening at the border, but my understanding is that's harder now with fentanyl because it's so potent that it's easier to smuggle.
In
Uh,
very, very small amounts, right? Because that's all you
correct.
need.
Correct.
Yeah.
None of these are silver bullets by any means, and I guess no pun intended, but like, frankly, one of the things that would go a big difference is cutting off this Iron River, but that would
Yeah.
require gun control measures in the United States. And I've just decided that's not something that's going to happen in my lifetime.
Doesn't seem like it. Yeah. So I think what is also interesting is that if you apply pressure to the cartels, right, you can affect their bottom lines. Profitability will decrease because they have to spend more money on terroristic violence and like fighting each other and fighting the government. That costs money. You have to like replace the people that get killed, whatever. But it is also the case that it applies selection pressure to these gangsters. So if it's wartime, then the people that are good at wartime end up in charge. And guess what you get then? You get even nastier cartels over time. And there's some evidence that it's like the Sinaloa cartel, they were pretty buttoned down. And the Jalisco New Generation, it's right there in the name. They're the new generation. And these guys were not buttoned down. They were doing the stuff that we saw in Sicario, right? Which is extremely nasty terroristic violence.
Yeah, and they
And
have gotten more and more violent over time, so that
and why do they do
tracks.
that? They do that to deter pressure, right? It's like this is what you're going to get if you keep pushing us. And the people that are in charge, they just get more and more ruthless because they came to power in an environment of chaos, right? It's not like a corporation where there's like an orderly succession and like you rise through the ranks. It's like some guy who's super violent has an opportunity because the king is dead. It's like, why not me? I'm the guy now. But there's 8 of those guys and they're all going to fight. So the most dangerous one is probably going to win. And now you have the most dangerous guy in charge of the cartel, right?
Well, I guess that I for the sake of having covered it, I have to ask you about the border wall.
Oh, what about it?
I mean,
Irrelevant.
so I mean, I don't disagree, but
Security theater.
explain why.
Yeah. So that stops, well, to a certain extent, it makes, I think, immigrating illegally a little bit harder to the United States. Like it presents a physical barrier that people have to get around, which they still do, by the way. But as far as smuggling goes, it's like the routes are extremely sophisticated. And what do they call it? They call it the March of the Ants in Spanish.
That's for the gun smuggling.
A
Yeah,
gun smuggling, but it's
yeah,
similar idea for drugs. It's like
yeah.
you're a homeowner, I'm a homeowner. Have you ever had an ant problem?
Knock on wood, not yet.
We had an ant problem last year, and they've given it a rest, but they'll be back at some point. And it's just like if they want to get in, they're gonna get in. It's like you cannot find every nook and cranny. You cannot plug all the cracks. You cannot apply poison to all the areas. It's like you can play whack-a-mole, but you cannot stop it. There's simply no way to stop it. And you can bring it down, but like it's endemic. It is actually
And doing
endemic.
that stuff costs tons of money and
Tons of
resources.
money. Yeah, it costs way more money to try to knock it down than it costs the cartels to keep doing it. And again, it affects their bottom line. It makes things less profitable, makes things harder. But in harder times, you get harder people running these organizations. So I almost like maybe Obrador, AMLO, the last president before Scheinbaum had the right idea. Maybe it's like, okay, leave these guys alone. Let's have the government actually collude with them. So we have a stable configuration. And then we just concentrate on competing with them in these localities and providing better opportunities. Obviously, the cartels won't like that, but it might actually work better over time.
But look, despite being from the West Coast, where I am now feels as far away as one could possibly. I feel like I'm on Mars compared to where I grew up. Like my expertise is on the other side of the world, and listening to you talk about this feels eerily similar, despite the context being so different to how we've talked about failed states in the Middle East.
Absolutely.
I mentioned the Lebanon case, but like what you're talking about here has like great similarity to how people were talking about Iraq.
Yeah, it's like
In the late
recruitments into
2000s.
militias. Where are the opportunities for people?
Well, no,
It's
like
like
the ultimate like way to solve this is to have a strong central government that can take care of these problems on its own.
yes,
And it's the same case here. Like if the Mexican government can extend the reach of its authority in a competent way, that ultimately is what's going to have to happen. The difference is it's right on, in this case, the United States doorstep.
Yep.
And so it has a
And we
much
love our
more,
drugs.
as you said, doesn't
Yeah.
everyone?
Yeah.
Um,
But the thing is though, what you're talking about is a chicken and egg problem, right? It's like you don't get strong state capacity without economic development, and you don't get economic development without strong state capacity. And it's like for states that managed to do this a couple centuries ago, like they got to a point where they can like control their territory. But now it's like we have these really stubborn insurgencies. We have these cartels. We have these infections, right? Where I'm not going to say it's too late. It's just way harder for that process to carry out because like the central government has real competition, in a way that like wasn't really the case in the United States. I mean, like we had a few examples, like we had mafias, we had a Mormon separatist movement, we had the Confederacy, right? We fought a civil war. So I don't want to oversell this point, but in terms of like states within a state or parallel institutions, I guess we had the Klan too, and we still do, right? But it's not the same order of magnitude, right? So yeah,
well,
it's just
like
harder.
you can kind of see, like, again, I don't think this would be the right move for a variety of reasons, but you can kind of see the alluring logic then of like, well, then what needs to happen is like the US military needs to like pound these guys
Conquer.
into the ground
Yeah.
and then like hand over that territory to the Mexican central government.
That won't
Um,
solve the problem though, because the central government won't have the muscles necessary. It's like being handed, control of a company that you didn't earn. Like you don't know what to do, right? You don't have the necessary skill set. So it's like at that point you might as well just run the whole place, which we don't want to do, right? It's like no, the Mexicans have to do it themselves, but they have to like go through the process of development to make it possible, and there's no way to shortcut that, which really
well,
sucks. I did my
again,
dissertation on this, so
yeah, no, I do think there's some things the United States could do. Like the gun part seems like in some ways, if not the heart of the problem, like the lungs of the problem.
that
Like
would help a lot.
you
Yeah,
could disarm these guys, they would
that
not
would
be
help a
in
lot.
this position. And
Yeah,
frankly, that's not Mexico's fault. Like my understanding is actually gun ownership in Mexico is pretty strictly regulated, and
yeah.
almost all of these arms are coming from the United States.
That's an absolutely fair point. I still see that as secondary, but it would really help. It would really help. If any, like if nothing else, it would cost the cartels way more to
Yeah.
resist. I'm sure they could get weapons elsewhere, and they
Yeah,
would,
that's
but
they would find a workaround. That's probably
yeah.
true.
But it's all about like driving down those profits and raising those costs in high leverage ways that we can keep doing. So I think that would be a great start. But it's like, how do you do that without gun control? I mean, I don't know enough about like how the smuggling's being done or where the guns are being bought, but let's like paying some attention to that would probably help. Yeah.
Well,
Anyway,
I don't think as is so often the case, I don't think we solved the problem, but we did elucidate it, hopefully.
hey, we're not policy guys, we're academics, right? We just look at this stuff and tell other people what they should be doing.
How
Cool.
so nice of us to be in
Yeah,
that position.
absolutely. On the internet.
Yeah,
Cool.
yeah.
All right. Signing off as two guys on the internet. This has been another episode of Global Tantrum. Thank you.